I tell everybody if your case gets filed, it might be 2 or 3 years before it gets resolved. So today we have Megan Davis here with us. Megan is the office manager in my office, but she's really the one who runs the show. So she's the one who does everything, who basically most of you probably know and talk to. She is on the management side of things. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've experienced over the years just in our law practice that you might find interesting. Some interesting stories, some interesting facts you may not have known. And so, Megan, I'll kind of turn it over to you. What do you think our audience would like to know about the day-to-day life of a law practice?
Yeah, so I think client stories are always interesting, but especially, trial stories, I think, and just different things that have happened there. So yeah, like you said, I've been here almost 8 years and I had no experience in a law firm before this. So everything's new to me and interesting to me, but you've been doing it a lot longer than me even. So I'm sure you have even more interesting stories than I do. So I would love to just hear a little bit about first, before you talk about interesting stories, maybe why you love doing this and why you've focused into this area for all of your career, really.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I would say for me, one of the primary things that drew me to this area of the law. So I predominantly do litigation, right? So I predominantly do courtroom work, which is I go to trials, I speak in front of juries, and just general public speaking, right? So public speaking is always something that came easy for me. It never was something that I had to work too hard for. It was always something that I felt like was natural. And to be a great litigator, to be a great courtroom lawyer, you have to be a good communicator. And being a good communicator is the number one thing that you should look for in a lawyer, is especially a trial lawyer. If you have a trial lawyer that is not a good communicator, if they can't even have a conversation with you on a day-to-day basis, right? If you get on the phone with them and they seem awkward and strange and they just can't carry a conversation, if that's how they are just with you sitting at a table, how are they going to be with 12 strangers in a jury box, right? I mean, that's why that's so important, is to be a good communicator. And so why do I love doing what I do? It's really because I love telling stories. I love telling my clients stories about their lives and what they've been through. And so that is one of the primary motivators for me, is helping these clients who are sometimes in one of the worst positions of their life basically get their story told. I've had cases, I mean, every lawyer's won and lost cases, right? I mean, if any lawyer tells you they've never lost a case, they're either lying or they're too scared to go to trial, right? But the reality is I have had cases that I've lost where my clients have come up to me afterward and they've given me a hug or they've said just thank you. And of course, I feel terrible. We just lost the case. I'm like, why is this person thanking me? And they say, because I felt heard. I felt like for the first time, my story was told. And so when you have a client that feels like their story has been told, even if the case maybe doesn't pan out exactly how they liked, those clients that truly were hurt or truly were injured or truly feel like their life has been turned upside down, one of the most rewarding aspects of that is just to make sure that they know that their story is effectively communicated. And so that's kind of how I got into this. That's kind of how the advice I'd give is to find a trial lawyer that is also a great communicator.
Yeah, I think that's great because I, can attest, being the person that deals with the clients a lot and talking to them a lot. I've heard their stories, same like you said. Maybe it wasn't the result you were hoping for, but I've never spoken with a client who felt after a trial that they, didn't get a good result, even if it wasn't a good financial result that we'd hoped for. So I think that's important. So why don't you share maybe an interesting story of a client in trial, or I know you have many, but
Yeah, so I would say my craziest trial story that I've ever had was I had a client, and first off, let me give you the background, right? So whenever you have a trial, whenever you have a case where one of the first things the judge does is they introduce all the parties, right? So they when the jury comes in, generally it's 30 or 40 jurors, potential jurors who are about to get questioned as to whether or not they're going to be on the case. And so one of the things that happens is that judge will initially stand up and will introduce himself or herself and will say, "I'm Judge Blank. Welcome to my courtroom. Before we get started with jury questioning, I'm going to go ahead and introduce everybody who's here," right? And so one of the things that happens is they'll usually start with the plaintiff and they'll say, "This is the attorney that represents the plaintiff, Mr. Michael Coker." And I'll kind of stand up. I'll give a little wave like this. And then they'll introduce my client and they'll say, "This is the plaintiff." And for this particular situation, the judge introduced himself, introduced me as the plaintiff's attorney. I stood up, I gave everybody a little wave, introduced my client, and then my client stood up, and instead of giving a little wave or standing up and introducing himself, he decided to do a dab, which I don't know if you know what a dab is. My 8-year-old son could tell you what it is. But he decided to dab in front of the 40 potential jurors. I have no idea why he did it. He did not tell me he was going to do that. And yet, this particular client thought when he got introduced in front of the jury, the best way to introduce himself to them was to do a dab. And so that was something that was the one of the craziest experiences I've ever had. And obviously, when you're a lawyer, you're never supposed to let them see you sweat, right? You're never
Right.
supposed to let them know that you're like, "What just happened?"
Right.
But when my client stood up and dabbed in the courtroom, that was probably one of the most unexpected and craziest things to ever happen to me.
Yeah,
So,
I
good
can
question.
imagine. I can imagine that would catch you off guard. So that's an interesting story. Why don't you share, which again, I can think of a couple off the top of my head that I know, fall into this category, but why don't you share maybe a result that you got for a client that meant the most to you, that you just really felt like worked out for the client and for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say I have one case that really stands out to me that really affected me personally. And that was a situation where I represented this young man. He was in his 20s, and his family had actually come over to the United States from Afghanistan. So this was in the middle of the war on terror that was mostly happening in Afghanistan, and his family had supported the troops and had supported the U.S. military. So they had kind of decided to be loyal to the U.S. military to help our servicemen. Their family served as translators basically for the soldiers that were over there. Um, and then obviously when the Taliban found out about this, they claimed they were traitors, right? And so they threatened the family and everything. And so the family was able to come to America and then live here, kind of to escape the retribution that the Taliban was going to give them. So one of their sons, or one of the young men who had served as an interpreter for those soldiers, ended up getting in a car accident and hiring me as his attorney. And it was not a big case. I mean, it was definitely not one of my biggest cases I've ever had. Um, but when we were negotiating that case with the insurance company, I won't say which insurance company it was, but it was one of the big ones. They had specifically told me that they were not going to settle this case because they thought that they were going to win this case hands down at trial. And the reason they said that they were going to win this case at trial was because they did not believe that a jury in Georgia would give a young Middle Eastern man what he deserved. And so basically, they admitted to me that they were not paying this young man's car accident claim, which was 100% legitimate. It was not a huge case, but they refused to pay it because they just didn't think that a jury um, would be sympathetic or would give anything to somebody who was from the Middle East, given the tensions that were surrounding this area after 9/11. And so we stuck with the case. Many other lawyers, I think, would have rejected it, would have said, "This is not a big enough case to go to court. This is not one that I would, I'm going to get rich off of. It's not worth the hassle." But I said no. I just could not stand by while this young man was getting taken advantage of, basically, for serving our country and not basically be given what he deserved. And so we actually took that case all the way to trial. And and I remember asking the question to the jurors. I said, "Would anyone hold it against my client because he is Muslim, or because he's from Afghanistan. And in that entire jury box, not a single person said that they would hold that against him. And they said, no, we're going to give this young guy a fair trial, a fair case, regardless of what happens. And to me, that said a lot about our community, right? That they were willing and able to put whatever prejudices they had aside and give this kid a fair trial. And then by the end of the case, we ended up winning the case. The verdict amount the jury awarded him was substantially over what any insurance company, the insurance company, had ever even come close to offering us. And so we ended up getting that resolved, and we had a great result for this guy who had risked his own life to serve our military members and to be there basically to support them, and that he was able to come to an American court and get justice despite whatever prejudices were out there at the time about his religion or his nationality, and have a fair trial and get a great result. So that's one of those. It's not my biggest case. By
Right.
far, it's not a case that made the newspapers or anything like that, like we've had in other cases. But this is one of the ones that meant the most to me. So I would say that one.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think that's what we both love so much about this job is just helping people who maybe need somebody to
Mm-hmm.
advocate for them. I think it's great sharing the trial experience and things like that. So why don't you talk a little bit about for people who maybe have never hired a law firm for anything, why that trial experience is important versus some firms out there and whether they will go to trial in their case.
Yeah, great question. So, one of the first things you want to ask your lawyer is how many cases have they tried in the past year? Um, because you would be amazed at how many lawyers who call themselves trial lawyers or personal injury litigators who have never, even in the last 5 or 10 years, stepped foot inside a courtroom. And this is unfortunately, it's a very common occurrence. And so, one of the best ways you can ask them, don't ask them how many trials have they done, because they might have done trials back in the 1990s or 1980s, but ask them, how many cases did you try last year? And if they tell you zero, then that means they are not the lawyer that you want to have on your case. Because the reality is you need a lawyer that tries cases regularly, that is involved in those cases regularly, because the law is always changing. Trial skills are always changing. And unless they're keeping up their skills and keeping up their efforts of knowing exactly how to handle various situations in a trial, they are not going to be your most effective representative and most effective advocate. And so, asking that single question of when and how many cases did you try last year? It's very difficult for that lawyer to make up a number. They can't lie to you in that situation. And it doesn't have to be a high number. It could be two, three, four. It could be something low. But be sure that they tried at least one case last year. Because if they did not try a case, that in essence means that they are somebody that the insurance company knows is not going to take the case the distance if needed, and they're going to lower the amount of that settlement based on that lawyer. And that's an unfortunate reality that most of the public doesn't know. If you have a lawyer who doesn't try cases, the value of your settlement is going to drop drastically.
Yeah, that's I think that's good knowledge because a lot of people call us and they've never dealt with it before. They've
Mm-hmm.
never, been in that situation, which brings me to my next question of, you know, we've talked before about, kind of how the cases move and things like that. But a lot of times when a case doesn't settle before we need to file a lawsuit, the clients kind of panic and go, "What does this mean?" They've never been to court, they've never stepped in a courtroom. Can you give a little um, you know, just a little brief explanation of how that process works for people who may be totally overwhelmed by it.
Sure. I mean, first, let me tell you the majority of cases settle without ever filing a lawsuit, right? So the majority of cases will settle out of court, especially if you have a lawyer who is willing and able to go to court. Because again, like I said before, the insurance company knows which lawyers litigate, they know which lawyers go to court, and generally those lawyers receive higher settlements and more frequent settlements than other lawyers do. And so that's one of the main things that I would say is, always look for that. But let's say you are a client whose case does need to be filed or does need to go to court. Unfortunately, courts and lawsuits take time. They take a substantial amount of time. I tell everybody, if your case gets filed, it might be 2 or 3 years before it gets resolved. And so you have to do this kind of time value of money analysis, right? Is the time that you're going to be spending to take this case forward to go to court worth the effort and the time that it's going to take? And so that's one of those things that you need to talk to your lawyer about it with your case. Is number one, if your lawyer tells you we're going to file a lawsuit, you need to ask them, well, what's the benefit of settling now versus taking this case all the way to court? Because it's going to be a long process. But let's say you do have to go through that process. So the first phase is called discovery. Okay. Discovery generally takes about 6 months, and that's where both parties exchange all the information they have about the case: documents, medical records, take deposition statements. Think of deposition statements as basically, you're telling your story about what happened in the accident, about your medical history. They'll take depositions, they'll talk to doctors. And so basically, everybody exchanges this information back and forth and makes a determination as to, hey, what's the big picture here, so that both the insurance company and the lawyer know exactly what's going on in the case. Once that discovery period ends, which, like I said, usually takes about 6 months or may get extended a little bit longer, then it's time to start getting that case ready for trial. And be things like you'll meet with your lawyer, you'll talk about the process, you'll talk about the questions that you're going to be asked. You're also going to maybe have the doctors come to the trial. So the doctors might come live to testify, or just like we're doing here, we might record them on video. So we might record a doctor's deposition on video. So that means that they don't have to attend trial in person, because it's very hard to take a surgeon out of an operating room, or even somebody like a police officer off the street, right? And so what we typically do is we record their videotape depositions and we'll play that for the jury. So all these things are happening in the build up to trial. Then you'll go to trial. You'll pick a jury. In most cases, the jury will hear it. In most cases here in Georgia, that'll be 12 people. And then you'll basically do what can last from, anywhere from 2 to 3 days all the way to 2 weeks. But it'll be a civil trial here in Georgia. And basically your lawyers will give statements. You'll testify. You'll go up on the witness stand. You'll raise your right hand, swear to tell the truth, whole truth, nothing but the truth. You'll answer questions both from your lawyer as well as the other lawyer. And then different witnesses will get interviewed. And then at the very end of the case, the jury will go back and they'll make a decision. The first thing they'll decide is who was at fault for the collision or for the incident, or if it's a medical malpractice, was the doctor at fault? So they'll determine liability first, or fault. And then the second thing will be damages, as to how much money do we award that plaintiff basically for the case. And hopefully that's the end of it. There can always be an appeal afterward if one side disagrees or doesn't agree with that. But for most cases, that's typically the end of the road, and that is when the case ultimately gets resolved. So that's a long answer to kind of explain the process, but unfortunately, it's a long process, and it just takes a lot of time.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one thing that can be, frustrating for the clients if they get into that phase of the case, is they feel like they want an update. They want an update, and unfortunately, a lot of times our answer is there is no update.
Mm-hmm.
We're just waiting at this point, and so I think that is good. We try to prepare them as best as we can, but I think that's important for them to understand that we want to move the case forward just as much as they want to move the case
Agreed.
forward.
Agreed.
So, I don't know. I would say my last question would be, what is, I know you've said, what's important, what some good stories and things like that, but what is just your favorite thing about working in this industry on a day-to-day basis?
Great question. Yeah, I would say my favorite thing about working in this industry is just meeting all different types of people that I would have never met otherwise, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've met people from all over the state of Georgia, from all walks of life. I've met people who, are in some of the worst moments of their life, and to feel that satisfaction of knowing that we help them, that we potentially maybe even made their life just a little bit easier. That's very rewarding, to meet all these different types of people and feel like you are absolutely touching people and touching their lives in such a way that is beneficial and helps them. I used to always say, being a lawyer is one of the, very few professions out there where you can generally specifically make a difference in someone's life. And so being a lawyer gives you that ability to touch people, to make a difference in their life, to do things that actually help them and make their life a little bit better. And so that, I would say, is my favorite part of the job. So, But yeah, so that's just a little bit of an interview of kind of what we've been doing, a little bit about the litigation process and a little bit about kind of what you may be interested to know about our law firm and what typically happens in a litigation case. So hopefully you enjoyed the podcast. If you like what you heard, I would say like and subscribe, and we'll continue to give you updates about what it's like to be a lawyer, what it's like to have a case, and just give you tips that can help you in the future if anything ever happens to you and you need to ultimately hire a lawyer.